All right, they're shutting the door, so I'm going to get started. So first, thanks everyone for coming. I love Identiverse. It's great to see people familiar faces that I've known for 20 plus years in some cases, and then getting to meet a lot more. So talking a little bit today about B2B, third-party management. Why do I say it like that? It is a controversial topic I have already discovered if I say B2B or if I say third-party management, depending on who you're talking to and the context. And so a lot of what I want to talk about today with you is how we have thought about this. So I am part of Ping Identity. I came in as part of the ForgeRock merger. I've been there for over 5 years. We've been spending a lot of time over the course of this year, the beginning of this year, talking about what we're hearing from a market perspective, talking to our customers, talking to our prospects about how they are managing these third-party identities, specifically in the context of these B2B relationships, and what we need from that perspective, what they need. And so I wanted to spend just a little bit of time sharing what we've heard and making sure we can sort of understand what we see from a market perspective and what's driving a lot of these requirements. So as I mentioned, Chip Hughes from Ping, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I'm in our product organization. I've spent time in pre-sales. I've spent time in consulting. I've spent time managing sales teams. So I've gotten to do a lot of different things, but it's really fun to be on the product side now. So why does this matter? Why are we starting with this? I always like to sort of start with one of these, what we call we scare slides. If you haven't seen this, the reality is right now from a market perspective, there have been a number of high-profile breaches, which I will not specifically call out, that have been caused by third-party and third-party users, right? There's some stats up here talking about them, but what we've seen largely when we talk to our customers is this has been sort of what I call the orphaned area of identity access management and governance, right? We have legacy solutions. We haven't really thought through how we're dealing with solving these particular sets of problems, and there has been a really large uptick, like I said, in breaches and security vulnerability areas discovered in your infrastructure, your enterprises related to third parties. And so ultimately what that has driven is we've seen a lot of activity in this space, and it is a really good time for you to go get funding, to go modernize, and actually deal with deal with these third parties. So I sort of opened with this. Fundamentally, one of the biggest challenges we see, how do we define B2B? What do I mean when I say third-party management? I've got a great slide up here. I can tell you internally when we were at Ping, we spent about 3 hours just talking about this type of slide and making sure we were all using the same language, the same nomenclature, because different things can mean different things to different people. When I talk about B2B, what does that mean? It means a business-to-business relationship, right? Why is that important? Because you are introducing really relationships that you need to start thinking about, and that can fundamentally change how you deal with what you would do with your employees, what you would do with your customers, how you deal with these business users that are coming in. Common examples that we think about, that I think about immediately. Supply chain, really common one that we see across a lot of different customers. Then you hear about these scenarios like B2B to X, so B2B to E, so business to enterprise, or business to customer or consumer, B2B to C. From a market perspective, some people just call that SIAM, the B2B to C thing. But it's actually a little bit more complicated. You generally have an intermediary, so think of an Amazon that's out there that is selling goods from a third-party business that they have a relationship to their customers. You also could have examples where you have things like agents, right, that are booking you on airlines that need to be able to address you, need to be able to access airline systems. All of those type of scenarios come into play. And the last piece that we don't always think about because we just call it SIAM is B2B SIAM. What's been interesting about this is, Ping has been in the SIAM space for quite a while. There are different requirements when you have business customers or customers that are your business than when I'm selling to what I could just call a belly button account, just a regular end user perusing a website. You have contracts in place, you have agreements in place, you have things that you need to be thinking about that you have to go through and to be able to manage. And so one of the big things that we think is really interesting in terms of what we're doing in this space, and I would dare say we fit into this category a little bit too historically, is this has been an area that people have talked about for a while, but haven't come out and built purpose-built solutions to go address that B2B type market. So if you talk to a classic governance vendor, you're going to hear a lot about lifecycle management. You're going to hear about registration. You're going to hear about approvals, workflows, those type of things. Classically, what you would get from an identity governance vendor. If you were talking to an access management vendor or an access control piece, you might hear a little bit about those pieces, but you'd hear about SSO. You'd hear about bringing your own identity, SAML, OIDC, all of the things that we expect to hear. But what we haven't necessarily seen and what we think is now really being required from an overall market perspective is starting to bring those concepts together in one unified spot where you, as a company, can have control over the third parties and how they're accessing your organization. So what do we think is required? What are we thinking about? How are we thinking about it? The first is you have to be able to model these complex relationships. And I talked a little bit about supply chain and agents, right? Travel agents coming in, dealerships, these type of things. All of those fit into what I think of as different verticals under a category that is B2B. For each of those type of verticals, you do have different types of relationships. And we'll talk through what that can look like here in a second. I'm going to dive into that. The second is delegated administration. And if you get nothing else out of the presentation today, the biggest piece that I find interesting is I talk to a lot of prospects and customers about how do you manage your third-party identities? Are you reviewing them? Yes, we have processes to review them. We have things like sponsors. Well, do those sponsors have any idea who those third-party users actually are? Well, no. I've got one user that's got 10,000 third-party accounts they got to go manage. That doesn't really make sense. So how do we come up with a model where we can start delegating out the administration, the appropriate controls to those third parties, but then coming back and making sure that you, as the parent organization, still has ultimate control over policy and policy enforcement down to that third party. And lastly is governance. So I talked about review there. But I think of governance when we're talking about these third parties as two things. You need to manage the relationship with that business-to-business entity, and you need to be thinking about that from a governance perspective. And then you need to be managing the identities that sit inside of that actual third-party business. So that is a whole lot more than what you're probably just doing today in your workforce for your enterprises. And one of the things we've commonly seen is you have all of the tools in place as long as you're doing it at a platform level when you're thinking about these third parties. So let's start with relationship modeling and what we've seen. Simple construct. I've got what you could call an organization. This could be a container. You could call this a lot of different things, but I have something that I'm putting users into. And so if I was using supply chain as an example, I could have, and I'm just using them as an example up here, I could have Lowe's as a parent company, a hardware company. It could be Home Depot, it could be Ace Hardware, it could be any of the major ones that are out there. And then I would have suppliers that are coming in. So think about Snap-on tools. Great. I would also have other suppliers that could be coming in. Somebody like a Black & Decker, right? Maybe a DeWalt. It's probably not quite good enough though. Because if you actually think about those suppliers, they are really large organizations within themselves. And they have suppliers that sit inside of them. And they may have mom and pop type shops that give them, they buy screws from that they're using or hammers from or those type of things. And you want to ultimately make sure that that organization can go through and appropriately model that type of organization structure. You also can have an end user. This end user can span across multiple organizations. If we think about the challenges of the past around this, and in my consulting days I delivered a lot of this, the way we would solve this problem is we would create a different identity, and that different identity would have to exist across your different suppliers, or if this was an automotive use case, across your different dealerships, and it would be really hard for you to start providing context around the user and what access they had. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We've seen with what we're doing from a SIAM perspective, you have to have better experiences. People don't want to remember multiple different accounts, different identities, those sorts of things. We want to have one user. We want to have one chip. Next, thinking about delegated administration. So there's two parts to this. First part, if I am a parent organization, so in that analogy I was using earlier, if I'm Lowe's and Black & Decker, if I'm Lowe's and I'm letting these end users come into my enterprise, I want to maintain control, right? Again, I'm just using that as an example. So what do I need to do? How do I need to be thinking about this? I want these containers of users, these organizations, to have owners. I want to have global administration rights within my organization where I can control them. I want to be able to set up a help desk if I have user problems or someone needs to be able to reset a password but actually needs to be able to get into my network. If I'm the partner organization coming in, I also want to make sure that I'm setting up appropriate admins. So that use case, what I was talking about, where that third party should be able to administer itself, you start delegating out the control and delegating out how users are managed to that third party so that it's appropriate, so that that organization is responsible for themselves. To do that, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate pieces in place to do this type of administration. And so you're setting up metadata around your orgs, you're setting up things like admins. And then functionally, what does this imply? It implies now I need to start thinking about how I'm actually managing my org, the lifecycle management of an organization, the lifecycle management of that relationship from an organization perspective. So there's a number of use cases that are up here that when we started talking about what do we need to be able to do, when I onboard a new org into my part, right? So I'm Lowe's again, I'm bringing on Black & Decker. What do I need to be able to do? Well, there's a lot of different ways customers go through and do this today. Some customers go through and they have a completely separate sort of vendor management process. You go through that process. At the end of it, you kick off an email to one of these sponsors, and they then need to be able to go invite that organization. That's one way to do it. If you go to Walmart and you look at things from a supplier perspective, they have an entire workflow. It's really long that talks about all the steps that you need to be able to go through to onboard yourself as a supplier into the Walmart organization. Not that dissimilar from a lot of the workflow steps that we have that are out there today that we can do with a lot of our tooling. It's just a manual process that they have listed on their website. You also may want to be able to let users just come in and directly register. Those are use cases you want to support. Once you've created this organization, you also need to start thinking about how you're maintaining it. What are you doing to make sure that you're keeping your administrators in place, the owners of that from the parent company in place, and keeping those pieces in place across the board? And then, what do you allow? How do you allow ownership changes? What do you need from a workflow perspective, from an approval perspective? If you have someone leave, if you have an administrator leave, what do you want to do? How do you want to make sure you're tracking changes? Next, and this is one of the really interesting things that we've started to see. You've got security policy. You have ways that you want these users to be coming into your organization. But those may vary based on both the capabilities of those third parties and, quite frankly, your assessment of their risk. So you want to be able to, on an org-by-org basis, specify, do users need to come in through federation? Can they bring their own identities and set up themselves with their own IDP? Do they have to use MFA? Am I comfortable with them attesting to the fact that they're using their MFA, or do I need to provide MFA? What does that experience ultimately look like for that organization? And the key here is that this can flow down across, right? So at a global level, we can define a set of policies, and then you can specify that as an administrator on an org-by-org basis to give them really smart span of control. And so what this can look like, just sort of highlighting the point, is for different organizations, you can have different users coming in and authenticating different ways. Most companies today have Intra in some way, shape, or form. Great. Do we trust that? Maybe. Maybe we want to add MFA on top of it. If I'm working with somebody who doesn't, let's give them a seamless end user experience. Maybe username and password, maybe passwordless. You want to be able to control all of that. Next thing that's started to come up, and this has been really interesting from a market perspective, is this idea of access reviews. And you can see that there's multi-layers to this and it's multi-chained, and I think it's really interesting. I've hit on the first point, which is if you're going to review a user and their access, have the person who actually understands who that user is do the review. So if we can set up a tiered structure where I've got third-party organizations that have owners that are tied to the parent company, but admins that are actually a part of that third-party org, set up your agreements, work with them, have those third-party admins review those third-party users. If you're going to do that, that implies you also need to start having your owners on the parent company probably review and make sure that your admins are appropriate. You should be able to do that. The other big thing that we've seen, and I talked about this from a relationship perspective, is that we have customers and prospects that are saying, can you force me just to review the third party itself, right? So just the entity itself. Can you give me a way to make sure that my agreements are still in place, that everything is correct, and that you are having me attest to the fact that this relationship is still in a good spot? We had one prospect who actually came back and said, we want to go through and run a credit check, a risk check, and we want to do that annually, and we want to make the owners of these organizations check that as a part of this organization. So that's a really interesting use case where we could apply a lot of our governance tooling against this as a part of an overall governance process. Next big thing, access request. So it is really important that you're also able to bring in access request, and you have scoped access request where we can go through and we can make sure that these organizations can only see the specific things that they need to be able to see to do their jobs. So you give them a catalog, you give that self-service experience to these end users, but only what they need to see. The other piece of that is you need to have workflow, and you need to have configurable workflow where you can say, if I need an approval, probably the first person that should go to is that admin that's within the org. If it's more sensitive, maybe it goes to the owner that's part of the parent org. And if we're getting really crazy where somebody needs access to some of the crown jewels of an enterprise, you can start doing things like owner-based approvals within the organization itself. All of those things give you really good control within your organization, but you have to be able to extend your workflow and your approval processes based on the context of the request, the third party themselves, and making sure you're going up through an appropriate approval chain. And so, just a case study, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I only have 25 minutes up here. This is an incredibly impactful area. So I hit on this earlier. I talked a lot about supply chain. I'm the workforce guy at Ping, so I think in terms of that's one of the use cases that's very similar to workforce and near and dear to my heart. But it applies in a lot of different areas as well. So you can see we have a global automotive company. I think they're the biggest in the world, if not they're one of the biggest for sure, where they've started implementing a number of these things and have seen just a lot of return in terms of their overall end user experience, a lot more security, and just providing a better end user experience as they modernize. And they're able to take sort of those third-party users and integrate that with their existing workforce, provide access to all of their applications with one seamless solution. The other big area that I would just call out that when I was going through sort of the verticals I didn't hit earlier is healthcare and where this can fit into healthcare. So if any of you are in the healthcare space, we get a lot of questions around, I have hospitals, I have trials, I have sites, I have patients, I have doctors, and I have clinical protocols. How do you marry all of these pieces together? All of the same concepts that I was applying to in terms of organizations, scoping, making sure you have appropriate approvals can apply to those use cases. So, quick session. Thanks everyone for coming. Key takeaways. First, if you're not getting budget around this, it is a really hot area. There's lots of stats out there. Reach out to us. Happy to help you with that. Second, think about this holistically, right? We're bringing the best of SCIAM with the best of sort of governance and workforce together. But if you're going to do that, you need to be thinking about how you can use delegated administration to really drive an overall end user experience that works while maintaining control. Next, when we think about this, the different silos that exist in the B2B use cases, usually when we're talking about it, it's hard to say, do I need this specific capability or this specific capability? We don't know. It's usually very unique for each enterprise we talk to and each part of their business. Most of y'all have some level of supply chain. You probably have some level of either agents, distributors, something else that sits there that you have to go deal with. And some of the pieces I talk about will generally apply, but maybe not all. And so make sure you're thinking about it holistically and across all of those pieces and where they all fit. So appreciate your time. I'm at booth. We're at this booth, but we're at the end of the week. So when we put this together, we said, come talk to us at booth 2301. But I'll be around, and I'm going to the Grateful Dead show tonight too. So if you see me there, come talk to me. I'll be happy to talk more about this. But appreciate y'all, and thanks a bunch.